Hello everyone, welcome back to the Tokyo Living Podcast. Today I am joined by dietitian Victoria Lindsay. Victoria, welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
For those who are not familiar with Victoria, I'd recommend that you go back and listen to episode number 75, where we got to hear a little bit about Victoria's background. Today we're going to be talking about artificial sweeteners and in particular aspartame, which has been in the press quite a lot recently due to reclassification from the World Health Organization. And I think it's really useful when things like this are in the lay press that we go through some of the science and some of the facts behind these things and help clear up maybe some misconceptions around these matters. Perhaps if we start just by talking about what an artificial sweetener actually is.
Sure. So artificial sweeteners or sugar substitutes are food additives that are added to food, beverages, or even personal care products or medication, things like toothpaste even, to impart a sweet taste without adding any calories. Now, depending on the sweetener, they're anywhere from 200 to 700 times sweeter than sucrose or table sugar, and through a variety of different mechanisms are able to give you that sweet taste without giving you any calories.
Now, for a lot of people, myself included, that like sweet things, to be able to do that without the energy surplus almost seems like too good to be true. And I think that that has, in some ways, marred the reputation of these products throughout their history. Perhaps if we just talk a little bit about the history of artificial sweeteners. How did they start, and how have they come into use in food manufacturing and general society?
Sure. I mean, it's pretty interesting to me anyway. I'm a dietitian, so I'm probably biased, but some artificial sweeteners, the ones that are derived from plants, such as stevia and monk fruit, have been used by indigenous populations for centuries. But others, the ones that I think people are a little bit more nervous about, the man-made artificial sweeteners really didn't come onto the scene until about the 1880s. So the first kind of commercially available artificial sweetener was called saccharin, and that was discovered on accident in the US in a Johns Hopkins University laboratory. Somebody was working in the lab, happened to taste something on their hand, realized it was sweet, searched all over the lab to see what compound it is, and next thing you know, saccharin is being approved and is started to be implemented into the food supply in the US and then beyond. And when you look at other artificial sweeteners, the history is oftentimes very similar. I mean, some are created with intention, but a lot of them are just lab mistakes. Someone's working in a lab, they go out for a smoke break, they notice their fingers taste sweet, and there's cyclamate. And aspartame, the one that's sort of at the heart of this controversy that we're going to talk about today, was also discovered in a similar fashion. Discovered in a lab in the US in around 1965. It was then, approved for commercial use, and that really, in the US, and then that really paved the way for it to be used worldwide. It's currently used in over 100 countries and is frequently cited as one of the most studied food additives and artificial sweeteners in the world.
I think I mentioned that that thought of something being too good to be true as maybe hurt the reputation, especially sort of in the early 1900s where there was this big sort of snake oil culture. I think that had a big impact, but there's also been a lot of sort of political controversy. You mentioned cyclamate. I think that initially was sold by DuPont in the 1930s, that had sort of Nazi ties, and through different stages in history you've had these other issues, a lot of the times political, which has also brought a degree of controversy to these products, right?
Yeah, right from the start, artificial sweeteners have been controversial for some of the reasons you mentioned. When you look at saccharin, the first commercially available artificial sweetener, after it was approved for use, after a few decades, there was really a push in the United States to reform the food industry. So there were a lot of large-scale reforms going on to regulate what was going into the food supply. And the director at the time was a chemist who was very skeptical of saccharin. Like you mentioned before, he had that feeling of, this is a little too good to be true. Should we be adding all of these things in the food supply? Let's keep things as quote-unquote natural as possible, which is a sentiment that still exists today. So although he didn't have a strong evidence basis for why saccharin was bad, he really lobbied the government and advised to ban and restrict the use of saccharin in the food supply. Unfortunately for him, he had a few things working against him, mainly which was that, number one, he didn't have a large enough evidence basis. A lot of it was just conjecture and worry, theory. Number two, saccharin was cheap. And that really explains kind of the popularity of artificial sweeteners in the beginning over the years. Saccharin can be, and other artificial sweeteners can be produced in a lab at a large scale for a very low cost, whereas something like table sugar requires human labor. It requires the cooperation of the weather to be able to harvest and supply. So when he tried to do this, there was a lot of pushback from not only the food industry, but interestingly enough, the U.S. president at the time, who was U.S. President Theodore Teddy Roosevelt, who was actually prescribed saccharin by his doctor for a weight loss regimen. But that usage for weight loss, for health benefits, was really, again, not sort of the main focus of the use of artificial sweeteners in the beginning. However, as decades have gone on, as public health needs have changed, as the culture has changed, that property, that being able to give a sweet taste for 0 calories has become much more valuable.
So moving on to aspartame then, what actually is it, and how does it work, and why are there these health concerns around it?
Sure. So aspartame is composed of 2 amino acids, phenylalanine and aspartic acid. And aspartame, interestingly enough, actually does contain calories. It contains 4 calories per gram, which is the exact same amount as table sugar. But because it's 200 times sweeter than table sugar, you're able to use an extremely small amount to sweeten a food, a beverage, or a product. For example, the amount that is in a Diet Coke or a Coke Zero depends on the size of the bottle and country to country, but like a standard bottle contains anywhere from 40 or 50 milligrams to 200, so an extremely, extremely small dose. And again, over the years, aspartame has been re-reviewed as more and more research comes out and points to either potentially positive, neutral, or negative effects. Now, IARC, which is the International Agency for Research on Cancer, they are part of the World Health Organization. They recently decided to classify aspartame and classified it as a 2B agent, which means that there is a possibility it can be cancerous to humans or possibly carcinogenic to humans. That was based on some research that showed that there was a potential incidence of liver cancer in both laboratory animals, but also maybe in certain populations. However, there's been some controversy over that because the doses of aspartame given to the laboratory animals far exceed what a normal human would consume, not to mention that the human studies were based on observational research. So they were just simply looking at a large population, noticing observations, and I think we all understand that correlation does not equal causation. So hard to tell if these people are unhealthy because they're, consuming aspartame, or the aspartame is making them unhealthy and giving them the negative health effect, which in this case is liver cancer.
I think those sort of observational findings get blown out of proportion all the time. And like you said, it's, correlation doesn't equal causation, and there's so many factors and so many different comorbidities that can impact there. And also, the fact that in those animal studies, the mechanisms by which something is carcinogenic in a rat, for example, is going to be very different, and in this case probably doesn't apply to humans either. With those classifications, you said that the 2B is possibly carcinogenic, and I think that's based though on those animal studies, right? And so if you're looking at a level 1, that's something where there is human research, whereas when you get into level 2A, there's maybe stronger animal research, but less strong human research. And then once you get down to 2B, you're looking primarily at animal research. And then in level 3, there's basically mechanistic, plausible mechanisms by which something might be carcinogenic, but no actual research in living species.
Sure. I like to call that the we don't know category. They say non-classifiable. I'm like, that tells me we don't know. We just don't know.
Yeah, I think it's interesting when you look at the other things that might be in those different categories. I mean, people might think of the things that we know are with a lot of confidence that are carcinogenic, like smoking, for example. But even in that level 1, there's things like UV rays. which the recommendations aren't to avoid going out in the sun altogether. It's be sensible with the amount of time that you spend in the sun, especially when you're in climates or during the times of the day when the sun's strongest, using sunscreen, all this sort of thing. And I think that sort of really points at the fact that it's the dose that makes the poison, and that is what needs to be taken into consideration when you're extrapolating these findings to recommendations, health-based recommendations. Other things like processed meat, which is generally not considered something that's healthy, but people might not think of it as being something that's in that top category of being carcinogenic. Other things that are in the same category as aspartame are things like Asian pickled vegetables, which I think, especially in Japan, a lot of people would probably consume.
And find very healthy, right?
Yes,
They eat for the probiotics, they eat for improved digestion.
Yeah. So I think that all needs to be taken into context too, especially when those things don't get reported in the New York Times or wherever mainstream media these things are coming out.
Yeah, there are several problems with this report when it came out. The first of which is the IARC monograph program only exists to determine whether or not something is carcinogenic, probably carcinogenic, possibly carcinogenic, or again, we don't know. What it doesn't talk about is the dose, and that's arguably the most important part of the picture. I mean, like you mentioned, the difference between medicine and poison is the dose, and we can think of lots of examples where there's something that's seemingly healthy that, if taken in excess, will become unhealthy. Water probably being the best example, right? We know water is good for us, it sustains life. However, if you drink too much of it too quickly, you can develop hyponatremia, get an electrolyte imbalance, and go into cardiac arrest. But we're not walking around with warning labels on our water bottles, saying that it's possibly harmful or there's, an adverse health effect. And so that's why, as a way to address that, the World Health Organization, in partnership with the Food and Agriculture Association, developed this joint committee called the Joint Expert Committee, for food additives, JECFA. And so JECFA exists to be able to quantify at which dose, at which threshold something becomes carcinogenic or not, which is a good thing, right? We can't have just is it carcinogenic or not without having at what dose, at what exposure level. The problem is that these were both reported on the same day. They both released their reports on the same day, and the noise around aspartame being possibly carcinogenic invoked so much fear that nobody seemed to read the other report that said, actually, we reviewed the same data that IARC reviewed and found that aspartame is totally fine to consume up to 40 milligrams per kilograms of body weight a day. So to put that in perspective, that would be anywhere from 9 to 15 bottles of diet soda a day for a 70 kilogram adult. I mean, that's a lot. I'm a dietitian and I look at a lot of food logs from people all over the world, based on my practice here in Tokyo. And I can't honestly remember the last time I saw someone that was consuming even close to 14 or 15 bottles of diet soda or diet drinks a day.
So, as a dietitian, what do we do with this information? What are you telling your patients in regards to artificial sweeteners?
Great question. So the last time I was here, we talked about intuitive eating, and I mentioned that it's just a potential tool in the toolbox we have to use to help people improve their health and their diet. For some people, intuitive eating is transformative. It's life-changing. It repairs their relationship with food. For other people, it doesn't resonate at all, and that's fine. If it doesn't work for you, we don't use it. There are lots of other tools we can use. And I feel similarly about artificial sweeteners. For some people, they're just not a good fit. Maybe they give them headaches. Maybe they notice GI symptoms, bloating, gas, discomfort of some kind. Maybe they don't like the taste. And maybe it's not an appropriate swap for them because they're trying to decrease their sugar intake, but maybe they do better just having a little bit of the real thing less frequently versus maybe having something with artificial sweetener on a more regular basis. Other people, artificial sweeteners are a great thing and they're a great tool, and I've seen personally some wonderful health outcomes with artificial sweetener implementation. You can ask nearly any dietitian, probably lots of doctors, and they all can probably point to a patient or tell you a story about someone who was drinking regular soda or regular juice or sweetened tea, and the only swap they made was to switch to an artificially sweetened version. And they were able to lose 5, 10, 20 kilos by only doing that one swap. Or they were able to improve their blood sugar. I think artificial sweeteners can be, very useful for diabetics, especially in the beginning when you're trying to get your feet under you and totally change and transform your entire diet. It's like carb counting. What is that? It's a big life change. And so having that tool available to them, I think, can make a huge, huge difference. I do have some hesitations, though. My first hesitation is there is some research to show that there are some effects of artificial sweeteners, not all of them, specific ones, on the gut microbiome. And I think that's an area of research that we don't understand, we don't know enough about, and I think it will be emerging. And so it's something that I'm personally keeping tabs on. Again, I haven't seen anything that has scared me away from, recommending it to some patients. But, there have been animal studies or smaller scale studies where they've noticed that there have been like a decrease in the, quote unquote, good bacteria in the gastrointestinal system, or possible things like insulin resistance in some populations with frequent artificial sweetener use. So again, I'm keeping tabs on it. I just want to see kind of how that plays out, but I'm cautious, but not overly concerned. However, another concern I might have with artificial sweetener use is if it's being relied on very frequently. And I'm talking like still within kind of the normal range of acceptability, but if I am working with somebody and they're constantly having sweet cravings, like all the time, like they're always craving something sweet, that sets off a red flag for me. Because while we are, as humans, we innately want sweet things, that constant seeking out of sweet foods, tells me maybe something's going on. From a physiological perspective, maybe there's blood sugar balance issues and they're getting a lot of crashes where they're wanting something sweet. And so I'm wondering, do we maybe need to add more fiber or more fat to your meals? Do we need to play around with like meal timing and spacing to correct that for you? There's also research to suggest that certain amino acid deficiencies can cause an increase in carb and sugar cravings. So that also tells me maybe we need to up your protein. I can tell you anecdotally that a lot of my patients, when they increase their protein intake, they do notice, they will report back and say that they have a decrease in carbohydrate, simple carbohydrate specifically, aka sugar, cravings. So that can also maybe be something that's going on. Or if it's not physiological, maybe it's psychological and emotional. So maybe they're being a little bit too restrictive with their diet overall. And so because they're not letting themselves have any sugar, they're breeding an obsession over it. And so it's just becoming something that they need to have more and more and more of. And so they're relying on the artificial sweetener to scratch that itch, but it's not working. So they're having more. And so that's a good opportunity to maybe repair a relationship with food, find some more balance in your diet, and maybe do some work there.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting, and sort of that the behavior around these different foods can be diagnostic a lot of the time. Yeah, really interesting. I guess sort of a more bigger picture question, when these sort of things come out in lay press, you look at the New York Times and says, diet soda causes cancer. How do you think people should respond to that? And what are your recommendations for people when they sort of see those big headlines and that, I guess we can call it sort of misinformation that's put out there?
I think the worst thing you can do, and I'm guilty of this too, maybe not with nutrition, but other topics, is to just see a headline that someone shared on social media and have a reaction to it, which we're going to. But I think that's where this recent controversy really took off. When you see that aspartame is possibly carcinogenic but not reading the rest of the article, or not having an expert break it down for you as to what this actually means, that can be really triggering and terrifying and cause a lot of unnecessary fear and shame when it didn't need to be there. So I think finding trusted voices, trusted experts in the field that are able to have, kind of a nuanced, kind of reasonable take on things is really important. There are certainly lots out there. that are doing the good work, if you will, which is great.
Sometimes that can be difficult to find, though.
It can be difficult.
With all the noise.
It can be difficult to find, which is true. I would say the more sensationalized it is, kind of the more emotional it makes you feel. Like that's usually a red flag that this person doesn't have kind of a reasonable, nuanced take. If it feels clickbaity, that's kind of a red flag for me too. But yeah, just, finding someone with credentials, finding someone with expertise, and kind of seeking them out for an analysis or a breakdown if it really is causing you confusion and fear.
Yeah. I think that's it's obviously applicable to nutrition, but all areas of health and wellness and fitness and rehabilitation. We come across it all the time. So I think that's really good, standard advice. Yeah. So Victoria, thank you very much for your time today and sharing your expertise. I've learnt a lot from just our chat today, and I'm sure the listeners and viewers have as well. So really appreciate your time making your way through the horrible weather today. We're recording this on Typhoon Day. So thank you very much for your time, and hopefully we can get you back on and cover some other topics in the future.
You're welcome, but last question. Do you use artificial sweeteners?
I do, so it's an interesting one. I go through periods with my training where I am trying to work on a calorie deficit, and I wouldn't call myself a sweet tooth, but I do like sweet things, and I do find that the occasional artificially flavoured beverage can be helpful as hunger suppressant's the wrong term, but something to take away that hunger a little bit. And I to be honest, I wasn't really a big soft drink drinker before. Like I never really drank that much sort of traditionally sugar flavoured drinks, but I do have the occasional either soft drink or even artificially flavoured energy drink prior to training as well. So I find that, this is sort of going on to another topic, but with training, when people are training hungry, that can often affect their performance, but it's not necessarily the actual fact that that they don't have enough glycogen in the system or anything physiological. It's more sort of that psychological impact of the satiety or lack of satiety. So I find that the little bit of caffeine and other stimulants that's in an energy drink, plus the artificial sweetness that gives that sense of satiety, for me at least, helps improve my training outcomes.
That's really interesting. That's cool.
So if you're watching or listening and you have any dietary related questions, please flick them through, and we'll be happy to get Victoria on a future episode, and we can answer those questions for you. Thanks very much for watching, and I look forward to speaking with you on the next episode.
Thank you.